The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erik Rhodes from Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air Magazine. Erik Koeppel studied the Hudson River School Masters. He spent 10 years looking at old documents, visiting museums, digging through dusty drawers to learn every technique. In this video, Techniques of the Hudson River School Masters, he not only shows their entire technique, he also does a plein air painting to start it out, just like they did. You're going to enjoy this.
I'm just adjusting the easel a little bit so that my body's in a position to see the view that I wanted, even though I'm going to be looking over my left shoulder, which, because I'm left-handed, is okay. Got my brushes and palette knife accessible here. And because I like to add and take away paint from my palette frequently, I'll probably just leave my paint sitting here as long as I have enough room. Okay, I think that's enough for the basic setup. So now I'll get my palette ready and start looking to paint. So we have our materials basically set up here. First I'm going to talk a little bit about the materials, then a little bit about the method, and then we'll get started. So what we have here is our basic palette knife. We have brushes, paints, and our solvent and medium. I'm going to start by talking about the solvent and the medium. I'm using Gamsol, which is a mild solvent. It's good for cutting oil, but it can't cut resins or varnishes. So if you use this in a medium, it has to be just with oil. So that being said, the medium that I have here is about 40% stand oil and 60% Gamsol. And what that does is it takes the stand oil down from its sort of honey-like thickness to a more fluid medium that you can sort of glide across the surface with glazes, and yet the qualities of the stand oil cause those glazes to set and be very nicely workable on the surface, especially on the smooth surface that we're going to be working with today. And so in this container I just have some of the Gamsol solvent. I'll just talk about the paints a little bit. The Hudson River School artists used a very basic palette, especially for outdoor painting, but even in the studio. It said that Gifford used 8 colors outside. Durand spoke chidingly to his students about not using too much color too soon, because color can deter you from seeing the drawing and the form and the atmosphere. And Gifford referred to landscape painting as air painting. And what that says to me is that the Hudson River School had a strong priority of light and atmosphere over strong bright color, and that they in fact thought that bright color could distract or take away from the light and atmospheric effect. And for that reason they used a very basic palette outdoors. These 7 colors up here plus white makes 8 would be what I would call my fundamental palette that I would be using for the most part. And then I've brought some extra colors in that I put in this row here that I'm only going to use if there's a heightened color or a particular pop of color that I feel like I need to get. But I have a feeling from looking at today's view that I might be able to capture it with just a very simple palette up here. But I've divided these colors into groups. We have the neutrals, just burnt umber, and the whites. I use burnt umber instead of other browns at the early stage because it has a lot of warmth in it, especially when it's transparent, and it has a lot of redness in the tone of the brown, which works really good with the warmth of shadows that we find out in the landscape. For the whites, the primary white that I use most of the time is Gamblin's Flake white replacement, which we have here, and I also have a quick drying white from Gamblin, which sometimes is good outside when you're traveling because you'll find you need your paintings to dry faster if you don't want to carry them wet, and that can be useful with us here today. So those are the neutral colors, and now we have reds, yellows, and blues. So the 2 reds that I have here are both from Gamblin, burnt sienna and Venetian red. The Venetian red is a red-brown that when it gets mixed with white will go towards a cooler side, where the burnt sienna tends to stay a little bit on the warm side. Now you can just put these here so you can see the difference. The burnt sienna is also a little darker, but when it's placed transparently on the light surface, it has a lot of power and warmth to it, and so it's a really good versatile color for outdoor painting. And these are both by Gamblin. And one thing that I find with a burnt sienna, it's not so important what brand it is, but there's 2 different pigments of iron oxide that are sometimes used in burnt sienna. One is calcined and one is uncalcined iron oxide, and I prefer to have the calcined burnt sienna because it has a slightly more opaque consistency, and it doesn't get so fiery and hot when it's spread out transparently. And if you use the uncalcined, then you'll find that if I were to do the same thing with my finger, it's a very bright orange, and that's not quite the color that I'm looking for in my earth palette. So the 3rd red that I have here that I don't think I'm going to need today, but that if I needed a really bright red, or I needed to get out of that, break out of the color range that I was in, I might add some Alizarin Crimson, which is a very powerful, very transparent color, and it's a cooler red, but it can also be mixed with these warmer reds to make a more pure color, and you can see kind of a pure red as I touch that to the Venetian red, and also a slightly darker pure red if I mix that with burnt sienna. But again, I would caution students against going with too strong a palette too quickly, at least if you want to replicate the effects of the Hudson River School. And so I'm probably not going to touch this tube today at all, but so over to the yellows. I'm fairly particular about yellows, particularly with the Naples yellow. So I have yellow ochre here and Naples yellow. But this Naples yellow is a fairly expensive tube of paint. It's from Old Holland, and it's Naples yellow deep extra, which is the only Naples yellow that I've found that has a fairly strong yellowy tone to it. And again, it's like the other two colors, it doesn't look very different from just like the Venetian Red and the burnt sienna are close together. These two colors are very close together, but they have different working properties. You can see that the Naples yellow is a little bit cooler, and it tends to go cooler and cooler as it's mixed with white, whereas the yellow ochre tends to stay on the warm side. And so I use these two in conjunction with the blues to make all kinds of varieties of green. Generally, like the Naples yellow will be used to make brighter, cooler greens, and the ochre will be used for the warmer, earthy greens along with the blues. And then the third yellow that I brought, if we really want to heighten these up to a higher yellow range, is Naples yellow, or is Indian yellow. And so I probably won't use much Indian yellow today, but I just want to have that there as an option, so that if these colors need to be made brighter, this color has the power to sort of do that. And especially if you mix it with a little bit of white, Indian yellow can make a very true yellow, where the other yellows will tend to go more muted. If I take a brush and just add a little white to them, you can see the Indian yellow still has a lot of yellow to it when I add white, and the Naples yellow goes very quickly to white. The ochre does the same thing, but is a little bit warmer, and so that's kind of the character of the yellows we're using today. And I'm just going to go on to the blues, which one of the blues isn't really a blue at all, it's black. And I use any number of blacks for this. I love lamp black, this is Mars black. But to me, all the blacks are fairly similar, and it doesn't really matter which one. But the black is obviously warmer than the ultramarine blue, which this is, and I'm not incredibly particular about my ultramarine blue. I like French ultramarine and ultramarine blue hue, and I've used Old Holland ultramarine blue deep from Old Holland quite a bit. This one, I believe, is a Windsor and Newton ultramarine blue, but I'm not too particular about that. But again, so obviously the colors from the black will be warmer blues than from the ultramarine blue, but again, there's qualities of the color that shift when you add white, and especially when it comes to the black, you really get the blue color out of it by adding white to it. And so if I put a little white with that, you can see that gray starts to be a blue, and the more black I pull into it, the more it becomes a neutral blue. Of course, this is a gray palette, so it doesn't show up too much as a blue, but if I put it in front of this burnt sienna, then the blue color comes out. But again, that's not because I'm trying to make the brightest blue that's possible with oil paint. I'm trying to use it as a more neutral, warm, cool color. And here, obviously, with the white, the ultramarine blue can form a very bright blue. And then if that's not bright enough, or actually too cool, the third blue that I sometimes add in, and that's also useful for making brighter greens, is Prussian Blue, which you can see right away is a really strong color. It's very dense and very transparent, and sometimes there's blues in the green range that are tough to achieve with ultramarine and the yellows. So like if I just demonstrate a little bit of a blue or green here by adding some Naples yellow, that's kind of a gray blue-green, where if I did the same thing with that Prussian blue, you can see right away that it forms a very bright turquoisey color, and that color I would consider dangerous. And so you don't want to use that color too much until you're really at a point where you say, okay, I have to get brighter, than the range of the palette that I'm using. So I've designed this basically in a way where I want to encourage, and I'll put the burnt umber out here too. I want to encourage students to go as long as possible and to get as much as they can with this row of colors here: the white, Naples yellow, yellow ochre, Venetian red, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, black, and burnt umber. And then try and go as far as you can discovering all the relationships in the landscape with just those colors. And then if you need a pop, if you really need something brighter that you can't get, then incorporate these 3 other colors only as needed: Indian yellow, Alizarin crimson, and Prussian blue. And a strategy for doing this is not only in the way that we manipulate the paint with transparency, and I'm just going to demonstrate a little more of the range of these colors transparently by adding some medium to them. We get a broader range out of the colors. Like, look at that beautiful yellow when I just add medium to the Naples yellow. We get a broader range out of these colors by adding transparency to them. And so I'm gonna encourage you to use that transparency to try and develop the full range that these first 8 colors have before you go on to relying on those other 3. And then to prioritize color relationships and light and atmosphere over pure accuracy of the color to what you find in the landscape. So that is to say, at first you're going to find with the limited palette that it might be difficult to capture exactly what you see, but what you will be able to capture is the range between the things that you see. That is, that like if there's a cool green and a bright blue, you might not be able to get the exact bright blue and the exact cool green, but you can get the relationship of those 2 things to be accurate. And you can always brighten up the color later with glazes, which is a tremendous, well-documented process that the Hudson River School were known to use all the time. So that is, once you've got the canvas all set up and you let it dry, you find that a blue isn't as bright as you wanted it or as bright as you remember it, then you might put a light wash of ultramarine blue, just like this, over the sky, and it'll just subtly tint it into that brighter range, maybe, which you recall finding in the landscape. So that's pretty much it for paint. We've talked about medium already. I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about some of the brushes that I'm going to use today. So I'll get the palette knife out of the way. A lot of the painting that I'm going to be doing is just going to be with round Sablette brushes. These ones are from Utrecht, but what's important to me is that the brushes are soft, and hopefully they can still get somewhat of a point once there's medium in them, and you can see that improve the point of the brush quite a bit. But these soft brushes I'm going to be using for spreading paint around a lot. Because I work on a very smooth surface, soft brushes are great to smooth out the paint and remove some of the streaking and paint texture that occurs when you're using transparent paint. So I'll set those aside, and I also brought 2 of these brushes, which are big, soft, flat brushes, which are really useful for smoothing out the sky and for smoothing out glazes in other parts of the painting. But the idea is, once you've put the paint on, you use a brush like this to glide across the surface and even it out. And I can even quickly demonstrate that right here on the palette. If I put a little paint here on this very smooth palette and it has all these brush strokes in it, I go like this, and it evens it out into a sort of smooth, transparent tone. And that's a very desirable part of glazing, because we can work up a transition between 2 things. You know, here's one blue and here's a whiter blue, and we can work up that transition very lightly, very roughly like this, and then smooth it out with this. The palette is a little streaky to get that, but that's the basic idea. Putting a little paint up here and then just softening it gently with the flat brush. So that's what we're going to use it for up here. Another brush that I use a lot for detail work and for drawing and for you know, anything tiny that I might do is these riggers, which are a liner brush, and I can just draw a very fine line and work on the little details of the painting. And this one will flatten right out once I add some medium to it, and we'll use that for that. So little branches, little leaves, details, highlights. These brushes are very useful. Once you've used it for a long time, you get comfortable with it, you can hold it far back and make a long, elegant line that describes what you're seeing. I also brought a few brushes with me that are just old, ragged, beaten up brushes that sit around the studio, but that I use sometimes for very specific things. And you can see that you wouldn't want to use this for any delicate work, but sometimes if you're filling in a large area of leaves, or if you're limited in time, a brush like this can be used to sort of make a general stippling effect, which can even out textures and creates the sort of complexity that some of nature presents to you. I mean, we're encountering a lot of like infinite textures out here. Texture in the bark, texture on the grass, in the leaves, even out in the deep space. And like sometimes if you sketch something in very loosely and then even it out with a brush like this, just blotting it around, you can see it creates a texture that can very much resemble nature. And then you might go in with a more specific brush and add just a couple details to that texture that will really tell the viewer what that thing is, and give the viewer more specific information. So it's the stippling effect of texture isn't something that you would want to use just on its own or just overuse, but if you have a brush like this to sort of describe large masses, then you can refine things using your knowledge of what you see and studying more of the subtleties that are out there. So that's all for the brushes. Next we're going to talk a little bit about the technical method, and then we're going to get onto the canvas and start working on this landscape. So just before we get started, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the surface here and the process. So we'll start with the surface. What I have here is a gessoed panel that is ultra smooth, and I don't know if it's easy enough for you to see that, but I just wanted to compare with this surface, which has canvas on it, which you can see has a textured quality to it. And you'll notice in the museum that many of the Hudson River School painters are working on a very smooth surface, both outdoors and indoors. Outdoors, they would often use prepared paper or panels, and then indoors, they would take their canvases and prepare them very smooth. And the reason is that the textured surface can sort of grab paint and cause it to have a texture on it, where the smooth surface, you can get a very even wash of paint without grabbing any texture. So when I put these two things together, you can see what I did with my finger there is just barely visible and is very even, but what I did the same thing with my finger here, it created a lot of texture. And that texture catches light and shadow and makes darkness. So we're trying to make a nice, light, atmospheric, airy painting outdoors, and the smooth surface will allow the most light to penetrate the transparent washes of paint, and so we'll come back with a light painting. And also the smoothness of this surface makes it more ideal for capturing detail as well. So I'll get rid of this, and we'll talk a little bit about this demonstration, which I've done for students before, which it's just an invented landscape, but it shows a little bit about the process that I'm going to go through. we've already done a drawing in the sketchbook to get an idea of where our composition is going to be, but we'll want to lay those things out on the actual panel like this. And all the same compositional principles that I was talking about in the sketchbook, we're going to try and get those things right here before we start actually applying color and tone. And we'll do it with a very light wash so that the colors that are in there don't interfere with the painting later, and they'll just disappear behind the second phase, which is basically a wash phase. So this second phase here was done with a three colors wash. I took one red, one yellow, and one blue, and those were ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna, and no white, and maybe a little bit of brown, but the idea is by not using white, I'm allowing all these colors to remain transparent, and I'm building the whole unified effect of the picture before I go into any of the details. And obviously with one red, yellow, and blue, I can't get all the colors specifically, but I can try to get all the color relationships, you know, like if the sky is warmer at the bottom and cooler and bluer at the top, and if these leaves are greener and yellowier than the cooler greens that happen out here, I'll do everything just by adjusting the amount of red, yellow, and blue and the amount of medium to create those long transitions. So obviously if I'm using more medium spread out really thin, I'll still have a lot of the white of the surface, and if I'm using less medium and applying the paint fairly heavily, I'll have that density of a warm dark color that will come forward. So these lighter, more airy things with more medium spread very thin go back, and then these densely painted areas come forward. And once I've established that whole structure of the picture from the deep space all the way to the very front, then I'll move on to the final stage of the painting, which is where it really gets refined. And you'll notice between this stage and that stage that I've left the tree a little bit smaller so it has room to grow out, and when I want to paint all these more specific leafy edges, I can do that. So I'll plan that into the process of the picture. You can see it was bigger again here, and then it got smaller for this part. But when I get over to here, I'm going to work from the back of the picture to the front. So I'll try to get a fairly resolved sky and atmosphere and deep space, and then come forward and handle like the little leaves that are closer to us and the trees that are closer to us, and I'll come across the grass, and then once all this back there is done, I'll end by painting as closely as I can the beauty of this group of trees which we've planned into our composition. And by then the sky will have set up and will be fairly stable and a little bit dry, so that I can paint these little leafy edges very particularly over it. Okay, so that's the basic process that we're going to follow. So now I'm going to move on to our surface and start preparing this to work on the painting that we're going to do. Starting to address our smooth surface, what I'm going to do is get a clean rag, and we're going to make a very light ground, just barely tinting it with some warmth. And I was just reading a text on Gifford's process of painting, and he did the same thing, just started with a very lightly tinted ground, and I'm going to use some solvent to do that rather than oil, because it'll help it be even, and it'll set up very quickly so that when I'm painting the canvas or the panel isn't too wet. So I'm just taking this off momentarily, and getting the rag and a little bit of burnt sienna, just spreading out that thin as a very washy thin tint of turpentine, or not turpentine, Gamsol, and I'm making the rag and the paint very wet so it'll spread easily over this surface with a very subtle tint, just warming everything. And an interesting thing that it said in the account of Gifford's process was that the reason he did this was one, obviously to warm warm the white of the canvas slightly. But the other factor is that it's said that it prevented the colors from being too bright. And that's an interesting sentiment in this day and age, because we have a lot of prioritization of brighter color. But it was interesting that they said very, very boldly in that account at that time that, like, part of the goal was to capture, was to keep the color calm in favor of light and atmosphere, and that is probably one of the things that is distinctive about Hudson River School painting. So now that it's all even, you can barely see that the ground is there, but we do notice that now the canvas is warmer and is just slightly tinted. And what I've done is taken a dry part of the rag and really taken off any of the excess, because I don't want this to be too, I don't want to lose the lightness of the canvas. So that's why I take the dry rag and take off the extra, and then fairly quickly that'll absorb in. But now as I put it up here, you'll see it still looks basically like a white canvas, but I know that there's a little bit of paint in there that that is going to be warming and affecting the paint that I put on. I just want to remind you as we do our drawing that this is, or as we start to draw on the canvas with paint, that this is basically what we're going to try and get on there. So I'm talking about putting a tree here, and it's good to sort of look at your drawing and remember and try and plan out where things are going to go, and just visualize it before you actually start painting, because so often students especially, like when they approach the canvas, they forget about the rectangle and then end up moving things from their original intention, and even I still fall for that sometimes, and I'd like to get the composition that I intended to get. So I just look at my drawing and I visualize it on the canvas before I start drawing. And I'm going to do the drawing with burnt sienna. And so I'm going to get that sharp pointy brush, and I'm still just using Gamsol. And I'm going to look out at the landscape and well, notice here actually with my brush that I'm putting a little extra Gamsol to get a nice soupy, almost ink-like consistency, because I want this drawing to be light, you know. And then what I do is, once I have a little puddle and that inky consistency, I wipe the brush so that it's dry. And that way, as I go and take paint from this puddle, I can control the amount of paint that's in the brush. And this is an important skill to start to learn, because it teaches you to be able to create values, you know, different values of paint in a range, from a very dark value where the paint is dense, and as there's more solvent and things get washed out, you can create a scale to a very light value just by controlling the amount of paint that's in your brush and the amount of solvent that's in your brush. You can see how quickly and easily I created the full range of values that are in this burnt sienna. So I want to take my paint from around this range, because I want to make my drawing of the landscape very light. So I'm just going to look out at the view and remember where I got my composition from, remember all the parts that I want to put in, visualize them on the surface, and then I tend to start at the foreground, laying in the key objects where I know I want them to be. So we're going to have a little bit of grass before us before we come up to the place where we're going to plant this grouping of trees. And I know I want the grouping of trees in so that I have room for a second grouping a little bit further back. And what I'm basically doing is drawing, but I'm drawing lines on the ground plane so that as I sort of put the little pieces together, I know where I am in space on the ground plane. And what I mean by that is, if I'm planting the bottom of the trees here, then I know that the next grouping of trees being back here will be further in space, because it's further up on the ground plane. So I'm always looking out there for little things that help to describe to my eye where things are in space and how they're moving into the space. So I'm finding that, you know, a field in and of itself is just a flat plane, but there's lots of things in the field, like little groupings of rocks and bushes and things that if I just sort of describe those things very lightly and easily, I can start to get a feeling for how I'm moving across that ground plane back into space. And just for the sake of clarity, I'll kind of insert the arc of that tree, and just so I know about the space that tree is going to occupy. But again, I'm going to remember that I want to keep the tree light and small and not over describe it, because this is only the first phase, and when I go back to paint the sky and the things behind it, I don't want all this wet paint on the tree mixing with the new paint that I'm going to be adding today. There's another tree out in front of that grouping, and the bushes lead us back to that. There's an arcing branch that comes back here, and then I'm going to go back to the edge of the field and put in that second grouping of trees. So this one ends in a cap there, and this one spreads roughly through that area. And what I find is once I've established a movement across the plane in the foreground, you know, I might put some of these bushes here to bring that corner forward. I decided to leave out a tree from this side, so I'm going back to the grouping of trees that are at the edge of the field. And what I find is that once I've started to establish this plane and I start thinking in space, then it starts to become easier to really draw space. So just by looking at what's behind what else, and so I paint this tree and then I paint the hill behind it, and I'm making all the pieces fit together along one plane that's just driving back. And so that hill, I made the line a little bit wrong. I'm just going to carry it on so the hill goes right over to there, and then working back towards that horizon. And the reason I was able to work across that plane towards that horizon is because I knew from the compositional drawing that I did in advance how all these pieces were going to fit together. So what we have here is basically phase one. There's enough information for me to paint the sky and start to insert more fully the elements of the composition, but I haven't overdrawn this with all kinds of details and things that are just going to have to get covered up in the subsequent layers as I try and capture everything that's in this view. So moving on to the second phase for my little description of the process, we're gonna block in the composition in just transparent paint with one red, yellow, and blue. So I'm gonna get this Venetian red out of here. We're just gonna use the burnt sienna. We'll take ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. So I have these three colors ready, and right in this area is where I'm going to mix them up and try and get the range of colors and values that are out there just with red, yellow, and blue. And something that some students have found helpful when I demonstrate is just, I don't do this every day when I'm painting, but just like I was taking that burnt sienna and stretching it out to a lighter value, and then if I take the ultramarine blue and stretch it out to a lighter value, then I can start to see also the color transitions that happen between those colors. And you can see it's a basic gray purple, but I can find a purple there out in the middle, and then I can find the orangey tones between burnt sienna and ochre. And then of course I can find the green tones between blue and yellow. Though I'm going to have to clean some of this up after to be able to paint. But I just wanted to sort of illustrate the transparent range of these colors and how easy it is to find those different colors just with these three, as long as they're not too polluted with white. So that's a very basic color wheel. And now I'm just going to clear out the area where I'm going to draw paint to work. And sometimes, you know, if I want to have an orange range and a purple range, I'll lay out, or say a purple range and a green range, I'll lay out extra spots of color on the palette just for that purpose. Like I might put a blue right over by my yellow just for making greens in this area. So that's kind of the reason that I lay out the palette kind of organically, so that I can put things where I need them when I need them. And you'll see as I go how that kind of develops. We're seeing a warmer color at the bottom of the sky and a cooler blue at the top. And early in the morning, that color at the bottom of the sky was more orangey and peachy pinky, and then as the day goes on it gets yellower, and then it starts to get whiter. But it's still fairly yellow, and we're doing the morning light here, so I'm going to go with it a little bit. I'm going to go with a warmish color at the bottom of the sky. And Gifford was one who said that the bottom of the sky near the horizon is the keynote of the picture. It determines the color of the light in the painting, and then the color in the light determines the feeling of the picture. So you can notice here that I'm going to paint right through my drawing as if it didn't exist. All I needed to know was that I could get back to that horizon without any trouble. And now that I know that the drawing fits in the composition, I can just go back and go full force into painting the sky. So I'm still using very thin paint because I want very light values in the sky. When you look out at the sky, you'll always notice that it's glowing with light, almost no matter what the situation is. And so I really want to preserve a lot of the white of the canvas here in the sky, or the white of the panel. And then I'm just ragging it out so that it's a nice even tone and establishing warmth down there. And it's a warm color that's still very, very light. And then that color transitions up to the blue tone at the top of the sky. So rather than start down here at this line, I'm just going to start up at the top and make a long transition, blending those two things together, which I'm putting the canvas just up, or the panel just up here, so that I can wash over that area with a rag without having it leave a little white shape there. And so if you look at the palette, you'll notice that I'm thinning out the blue a lot to make a kind of inky consistency. And I'm just spreading that color fairly aggressively with the brush. And then I'm going to quickly rag it out to try and make the transition down to that warm color. So this is what we can achieve without having any white. At an incredibly light value, we can have a glowing transition between, a glowing light transition filled with a lot of complexity of color, going from something light very seamlessly down to something very warm, without ending up with muddy gray colors in between. And so I think, I know that this is very light, and I don't know how well you can see it, but I think if I cover up the bottom, you can start to see that there's a long softness in this transition that really glows with the light of the sky. And I did that just by very quickly ragging these colors together. And so rather than fuss with that and do all kinds of clouds, you have to remember that I'm on the second phase, the more watercolory, washy phase. I'm just going to move quickly forward through the composition, starting down at the horizon with a blue that's a little bit purpley, and I'm just going to wash in that horizon. And if the color is too dark, which that might be, I'm just going to wash over it again after ragging my brush. You might have noticed I just dried my brush like this, and when you dry your brush, it's like a sponge that can pull up the paint that's too wet. And so I just lifted up the darkness from that, leaving it really light, and then I can sort of adjust it if it's not blue enough. If it's too light, then I can put more blue into it and try again. And I'm remembering that I'm going to be painting all these things again, so I don't want to be fussy. I just want to get it even. And I'm just going to flatten it out with that soft brush and move forward, because what we want at this stage isn't a finished painting. It's just the big transition from there up through the hill all the way to the front. I want to look how the color changes as it comes forward, as I'm making this big transition. So what I notice is the blues are the bluest at the back, and this is in varying degrees of scale. This is almost always the case. They're bluest at the back, and in the shadow value especially, they're getting more purple as they come forward until the foreground shadows are eventually going to be fairly red-brown, like fairly warm and dark. So we're really going from blue to warm red-brown through purple when we're crafting the whole movement of light and color through the space, especially in the shadows. This can be hard to see sometimes because, especially when your scene gets filled with light, you really only see the color of the things in the lights, like you see the greens on the trees and things, but the key to the atmospheric space is in the shadows. So if you look at just the deep dark shadows, you're going to see blue, and then you're going to see a purplier blue, and then it's going to start to get warmer and get to be this kind of atmospheric gray, purple, brown, and then it slowly gets up to a warm dark brown in the foreground shadows. And that you will see almost all the time in Hudson River School painting. But you know, with this palette, I'm going to make those purples out of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and that'll help bring out their grayness. You might have noticed I haven't incorporated much medium yet. That's because I want to keep the paint really thin, but as I get to the foreground, I'll slowly be incorporating more medium to suspend the paint, suspend the paint in that oil, which will give it more vibrancy and warmth and rich darks. Like paint suspended in oil makes rich, warm darks. So there's my kind of gray purple. It got a little bit dark, so I'm just going to rag it out. And you see, once I put that in, that made the blue look very, very light blue. And I might even just work on the transition back from the one mountain to the other a little bit. Bearing in mind that we have a long way to go, and we're just making a long transition from back to front with the intention of coming back and painting these things. So I've gotten up to my field edge, and I'm gonna get onto the hill that goes across in front of the landscape. And hopefully you'll see that, like, I'm keeping this all simplified and warm, but I'm slowly getting denser as I come forward in space. And then what often happens, which I don't know if it'll happen here yet or not, is when you get to the front and fill in the front, then you can start to see where the weaknesses and the transitions are. And you can make all kinds of adjustments, either here or in the next stage, to to accommodate for those. And I'm going to recall that early on this morning there was a shadow coming across here, which was compositionally a good idea to help the space to curve back and wrap around. So I'm going to put that shadow in. And then I have denser, darker shadows at the bottom of the trees that are going to be in that area. Starting to incorporate more burnt sienna as we're working up towards a browner shadow. And then we'll leave a little bit of warm light spilling across this foreground. It's getting to the phase where it's far enough along that I have to start thinking about abolishing this white ground, because it's as you move forward, it starts to mess with your ability to see what you're doing. But I'm going to get those long morning shadows coming across the foreground. I'm completely obliterating that little drawing that I did, but the purpose of that thing wasn't to be some final destination that you leave till the end of the picture. The purpose was to know that as you come forward, you'll have room for everything that you want to be in the painting. It's just placement in the rectangle, basically. So far I'm still just burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and yellow ochre. And if the burnt sienna is too reddy orange, you can neutralize it into a little bit more of a brown with ultramarine blue. Or if that gets too cool and you have trouble with the blue coming forward, then you can incorporate some burnt sienna or burnt umber at this time, which I'm not going to do yet, but I may add some burnt umber before the end of this phase. So as I look out at the landscape and analyze colors, I'm not really being too particular yet about getting the color just as the color I see out there, but I'm more just building large relationships of color. Like I said, once you get forward, you can start to see the weak points a little more. Like I see a weak point where I've left light here, which makes this area come forward from that area. And what I want to do before I go on is put a little more of a purpley color in there, just to make sure that I'm transitioning back through that area. And as you can remember from our drawing, we're going to have all kinds of careful trunks drawn in here. We're going to have things blocking here, and we're going to have trees here. There's a lot of trees out there that will block a lot of what we put back there, but we want to establish this big color phase before we go on to those details. And the reason is that doing something like this really keys your eye to the relationship of the space. Like if you just start going to try and mix all the little colors individually, it just becomes this endless array of complexity out there that you could never possibly get every little thing that's in it. But now that I have this structure, sky coming through deep space, coming up to a foreground, and the foreground dark shadows, then that's going to allow me to try and place everything I do within a range. You know, I have a range here, and if I'm working at that level of space, I need to know I need to stay in one little range, and if I'm here, I can work more in that range, and as I get forward, I start to have the real warm darks. A lot of problems students have when they start to work on the details of the hill, as your eye looks into it, it comes forward because your eye adjusts itself to the range that you're looking at out there. So like if you focus in on little groups of trees out here and look very closely at them, you start to see the darks as darker and the lights as lighter, and that contrast pulls that thing forward. So by establishing this range, you're saying to yourself, okay, I am going to stick to that range out there and not let my eyes trick me as I adjust to the various little areas and focus on the big transitions of the big picture. So I'm going to get, before I move on to the next phase, I'm going to get my slightly smaller, sharper brushes out and just do a little bit of placement of these trees and trunks. Not so much that I'm not going to be able to work in behind them, but I do want to know where things are, and also I'm going to incorporate the burnt umber so that I really have a full range of warm darks in the foreground. What I mean by that is, well, you can see how when I put the burnt umber on, how it really comes forward and sits as a foreground shadow, and it helps to make the background really glow with light. So I know I'm planting trees right here, and they're going to be arcing up here, and I'm just going to very lightly indicate those things because I don't want to be tied down, and I don't want too much paint messing up what I'm doing later. But so that's going to be there. That slightly more foreground tree is going to be there, and it leans away a little bit. And then the trees that are forming that wing are going to go up to about this height. And so I'm just taking a little bit of information from nature and reminding myself of the drawing that I washed away. There's going to be some larger middle ground trees there, a little middle ground there. And I'm going to remember that I'm going to occupy this space with foliage. I think just to make sure you can see where I'm going with this, I'm going to include a little bit of the foliage and trunk, so I'm not going to get every specific detail about it. But I do want you to be able to see how once I put something up in front of the sky, how it really makes the sky fall back and glow with light. So I'm going to start to draw in this tree, and you know, tree drawing is its own whole art, just like drawing anything is its own whole art. You can spend a lifetime trying to improve on your tree drawing. But I've found that by like studying the character and gesture of big clumps, you can establish a sense of the tree that you can then go in and become more specific about. But I'm just going to block in those big clumps fairly loosely, and I'm allowing plenty of sky to come through. As I bring this tree forward off of that bright light sky. It's always good to consider when you're working on clumps of foliage where you are in space, like if you're on a clump that's coming forward, if it's falling back into shadow, and that gives your tree a sense of volume to consider that. I'll incorporate the deepest shadows more into the center of the tree because it's the most likely area to catch dense cast shadows from all the leaves outside of it. And then the tree sort of becomes more atmospheric and flows with the sky as it comes out towards the edges. But I'm not copying exactly what I see here, but I'm looking for the big movements of space that are out there. And also I'm looking for the movements that work with our composition, which is to say that we want to wrap around and fly out to space. And you'll find that there's a lot of harmony in nature, and that a lot of times the things that you're looking for are right there. I'm incorporating a little more blue into the green because I'm a little bit further back in space. So it's just going to have a little more atmosphere and be a little cooler. And that's a good thing to think about is just, even if you haven't quite trained your eye to see all these subtle relationships yet, just to think about where you are in space, and to know that if you're moving back, if you're at a different point in space, for the painting, for air painting, for painting light and air, you should be able to perceive an atmospheric transition between a different level of space. And if you look for that, you'll be able to find it. And like I said when I was drawing, you continue to pay attention to the character of the tree. Like think of the tree as if it were a person, and like what type it is and what it feels like, and capturing that feeling will enhance your perception of the tree. Like Durand, though he was greatly into copying nature exactly, he also highly praised Raphael's work, who everyone is aware was not very much of a direct copier of optical situations. Raphael was copying a truth that was revealed by the character of things and by their nature in the universe, which is a philosophical truth. And the Hudson River School artists were into that idea. Durand wrote about Raphael and wrote about the difference between he wrote that Raphael was copying what he saw, but that what he saw was a thing of incredible beauty, and that's what made him able to copy it in that way, which was so unique, and not necessarily what he was seeing optically, but what was the truth of the thing. The truth of the thing is beautiful. So I've got my deep space plane established, and I'm going to move forward to that secondary hill. And while I'm working on that hill, I'm going to be thinking of the transition forward into the middle ground. So as I work on this area, I'm not just thinking hill, I'm going to be thinking furthest back hill, moving to forward hill, moving to middle ground. And that way, I'll be moving one loop of space that's going to prepare me to work on the foreground. And I always want to have that in mind, that this hill is not a flat phenomenon. It's a large mass of Earth that's moving in space, and that's going to be crucial to this composition. It's really where that atmosphere starts to materialize itself into forms, and we're going to try and get as much detail as we can into the forms of that area without bringing it forward. So I need a more purpley, cool shadow color. I'm going to get that Venetian red a little bit closer to that white, and I'll put a little ultramarine blue over there, and I'll create this area right there. Someone described the area on Gifford's palette as where he mixed colors as a battleground. So if I want to make a purple, the battleground will be here between red, white, and blue. Let's get a little bluer purple. Let's see where we are. I want more white in that. I want a nice even, more white for a cool color will make a nice even layer of space. And so I'm just putting a nice load of white into there and spreading it around so it has a smooth atmospheric quality. I'm going to start to come up to the edge of the contour of the hill. I'm going to try and not make it too even. I'm going to add little tree edges up there in a little bit. I'll add some texture to it. I'm going to use a warm brown color because I know a little bit of that color from the sky underneath is going to come through. So I've got burnt sienna and burnt umber. I'm also going to grab a brush to use as a maul stick. And I wanted to move my tree in a little bit closer to the landscape. So I think I'm going to plant that pair of trees right about here, just leaving a little bit of area behind it. I'm just going to add a little bit more medium so it's a nice light line when I start to trace out where I'm going to place this tree in the composition. I want it to be, I want it to have that feeling of loft, that it really, really swoops out into the landscape and rises up into this area of space. So this doesn't have to be perfect trunks yet. I'm just planning out the big motion of this tree so I know that it'll occupy the space that I want it to occupy. And these lines will probably get buried under the more detailed work as the tree develops. And these beautiful oaks always have these lovely swoops in their branches, and I'll start to think about that as I block this in. Isn't it kind of nice the way this curve here counteracts the curve of that hill and makes a lovely harmonic design that is subtle. It doesn't beat you over the head with it, but it's apparent, and it's a gesture that shoots back into space. Those two things against each other. So I'll plan a little bit where I'm going to have the counter curving tree and its sort of massive foliage. And then I know I'm going to have some more trees over here blocking out a lot of the distant space on that side. And so if I have these ones planted on the ground here and here, then I have a deeper position of space here to sort of create a nice grouping of trees to cover up that space so that we can really get back into the composition. A lot of times when I'm painting a studio painting, I'll go through several different figures before I find an option I like, but I might also wait a long time and look at the painting. And as I've looked at it for days and days, I sometimes discover right where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing. So we'll see if that happens later.
I hope you enjoyed Techniques of the Hudson River School Masters with Erik Koeppel. If you want to learn more, you can find it at lilyartvideo.com. Now let's get to the interview with Erik. Hi, I'm Erik Rhodes. Today we're here with Erik Koeppel. Erik and I first met at an opening in New York City at the Wally Finley Gallery several years ago. I was in town doing some work, and Peter Trippi, the editor of Fine Art Connoisseur, said, "Hey, let's go over to this show." And we went to the opening, and I was blown away by the work. I had not seen any contemporary artists doing Hudson River School paintings that were equally as good, that were stunning as those painted by the Hudson River School. And so Erik and I met at that time, but I didn't quite frankly remember. He didn't really leave an impression on me. No, his paintings left a big impression. He was busy. I didn't get a chance to talk to him that night. We then met again much later when we had an occasion to spend quite a bit of time together and become friends, and we painted together. And I just think that Erik is a genius, and one of the reasons we decided to get together and do this interview and do a demonstration of your work. So Sanford Gifford said that an artist is a poet. What are you?
An artist is a poet, Erik. I would say that, art has varied between a more sort of Stoic philosophy and a more romantic, poetic philosophy for most of the entirety of art history. And I think that what great artists have done is tried to find a balance between those two things, where maybe they're not so passionate that they're just floating away on feathers in the romantic side, but not so stoic that they don't feel human compassion. And I think that the great artists of the past have really looked deeply into themselves to try and understand their own humanity. And if they've done their work well, then they've shared that humanity in a way that everyone can understand.
Is that relevant today?
Well, I think the kind of human issues that I'm talking about aren't things that change and disappear with fashion, but are things that have been a part of humanity for the whole history that we're aware of. Although there's lots of fashions and lots of cultural phenomena and technology that are ever changing, there's also certain things that every human being that's ever been born and ever lived has had to deal with. Questions about why we're here, what are we doing when we're feeling love, when we're feeling fear, when we're worried about death, illness, birth, rebirth. These things are ideas that I think every human being can relate to, and I think that the highest art taps into these ideas and reveals to its viewers something profound about their own existence.
So when you paint these beautiful, bucolic landscapes, what is it that you're hoping to say?
Well, the landscape in painting is the big world. It's the big universe, and I think for human beings, we're really trying to understand our place within that universe. And I think if I were to relate the experience of a landscape painting to an actual experience that a human being would have in a landscape, like if you can imagine yourself hiking up a mountain and the hike is hard and you're going up these rocks and you've never been on this hike before and you don't know what's at the end. There's the creation of this amazing feeling of satisfaction when you arrive at the top of that mountain and there's a stone ledge there and you look out to this epic, amazing view. And what you're experiencing there is the sort of transition between something that was hard and closed in, buried under trees, out into something that's just profoundly large and open and wide. And that experience is a metaphor for a philosophical transition in life, from an obsession with these smaller things that happen in our lives. So-and-so did this to me and I lost this money and now I got some back and I'm happy. And, there's all these little things that happen, but there are these specific moments where something really profound happens that washes away all that individuality of you, and you're somehow dissolved into that sense of just being a part of that whole universe. And painting, for me, the landscape isn't really about depicting what's seen from that ledge at the end of that road, but depicting the human journey into that world, and then discovering that incredible moment at the end. And so it's not really about just like making a painting of a landscape isn't about what the landscape really looked like. It's about the experience of arriving there and having that profound sensation. And I think the historic artists, like the artists of the Hudson River School, were very interested in that idea. Like when they put these big rocks in the foreground and transition of a stream bed out towards the landscape, and then it opens up into this big epic view, and you look up and you see the trees coming over your head, and you look down and you see the ground beneath your feet. I think they're really trying to create a profound human experience where the viewer walks into that picture as that traveler on that road and arrives out at that deep view through all these transitions of space.
Well, there were also signals at that time, well, throughout the history of painting, probably less so in our world today, but throughout the history of painting, there were things that were painted in that were signals. You know, a rose lying on the ground had a particular meaning. A dead branch in a painting had a particular meaning. Have you studied what these meanings were and how some of the Hudson River painters were doing it?
Yeah, I mean, you can study the meanings historically, and some things have been written down about it, and I love these little books on flowers and trees and stuff and what the trees mean, or even like Ovid's Metamorphosis, where he applies human meaning to all the changes in the universe and talks about the development of the laurel as the crown of the poet. And I love these ancient historic references to the elements of the landscape. But I also think that fundamentally for those symbols and metaphors to really come through and to work as a work of art, they have to be something that you can, let's say, it's something that's enhanced by that mythology, but it's something that you can understand just by your own viewing of the picture in a more fundamental way, just as a human being. Like if we see in Thomas Cole's painting, as we do very often, a big stump coming up in the foreground of a painting with one large broken branch that's been torn off of it. And then from that wreckage of that large tree, we might see a young sapling sprouting out of that stump and growing beautiful green leaves. It's a clear metaphor, and it's very apparent that these artists were sort of personifying the landscape and putting things that they felt about humanity in it, and the way that as people, you know, we experience loss, and then we grow and learn from that loss. And though we think of our lifespan as just one flowing from start to finish, like there's really lots of deaths and rebirths in our life, and lots of hard things that new beautiful things come out of. So I think those symbols should be things that we can get just by looking at them, that we don't necessarily have to research to know them.
There are a lot of discussions today about repeating history, about painters who are painting like the painters of the past. Some feel that, I think many of us feel that it's important to learn these techniques that have been passed from generation to generation and were almost lost. And yet there are some who argue that that's been done, that we shouldn't be repeating the past, that we should be, if we're using these techniques, we should be using contemporary sensibilities that might be reflecting society as it is today. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, I think when I was addressing the issue of things that stay and things that change, that is that fashions are things that come and then go. And a lot of what I would consider a contemporary culture of any period would be what I would consider fashion, and I would be thinking about sifting through those things towards what's more universal and profound. So I haven't really tried to represent my culture today in any more that every culture is in some ways fleeting. If I think I'd like to take that question a little bit in the direction of say just looking at historic painters and what they did. A wise person once told me that you know, if I really wanted to accomplish something philosophically with my work, that rather than make my knowledge wide or broad on that subject, that I had to make that knowledge deep, to have what's called a deep understanding of the subject. And I think like it's a self-indulging act to say that one or another aspect, like if we're going to admit that something is a masterpiece and that thing is profoundly beautiful, I think it's self-indulgent to say that it's just one or another part of that thing that's beautiful, and that I can just take this part or that of it and say that I really understand it. So when I've looked at historic movements, I've really been trying to look deep into those things and understand the whole of that thing, like why every single part of it is the way it is, and why they did all the things that they did, and how they all fit together. And I do believe that that's what some of my favorite masters of the past have done. Like I think just looking at landscape painting, you know, we find the originators of what I would say, what became classical landscape painting. We find Claude Lorrain in the French school, and then we find Ruysdael in the Dutch school, and most landscape painting draws from these two masters, and they were drawing from the backgrounds of figure paintings, basically. Like, but then if I look at an artist like Corot, who I love, when he was young, he seemed to be just trying to be just like Claude and just understand very deeply what Claude was doing. And then when we look at Turner when he was young, his early paintings, they look just like Claude's paintings. You know, he doesn't look like he's trying to make any contemporary statement or any change. And the theory that I've sort of had on that subject is that the individuality of these artists develops later by their discovery of the sort of fundamental truths, and in the works they're able to make work in a different way that still achieves the same fundamental goal. But in the beginning, to achieve that goal, they need to understand every single part so deeply that it takes guidance to do that. And I think it takes the guidance of a really true master to understand.
I once took a photography course in Vermont from a fellow by the name of Fred Picker, whose work hangs in the Museum of Contemporary Art. And Fred had a group, a workshop of men and women who were doing 4x5 photography. And I was very young, and I was very frustrated because I wanted to be out doing creative things. And very wisely, he said to me, study it deeply so you understand the technique, because when you're out doing creative things, you'll be frustrated because you won't know how to accomplish what's in your head. And if you study it deeply and you get to the point where it becomes second nature for you, then you can become creative. Then you can do your own thing. Right now, what I want you to do is follow the plan and really learn deeply how to accomplish these goals. And I think that that strikes me as a critical part for painters. When I first started to paint, I was learning by emulating some of the other masters. I would copy their pieces, and the atelier that I was involved with said, copy these pieces. Don't sell them, you know, don't say that, don't make them frauds, but understand them. And it was interesting to me, again, because I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to create my own things. But it was interesting how one slight curvature of a brush stroke made a figure look fat versus thin. Little subtleties that you pick up from these people about edges and light and color and everything else. So I think that certainly the philosophy of depth and really learning the techniques deeply makes a tremendous amount of sense. Then you can go in your own course in the future.
Yeah.
So are you on your own course?
I've started to feel like I'm getting there. I mean, I think if I were to define what one's own course is, it's going to be the point where one understands the common thread between disparate things more thoroughly than the different things themselves. And if I can just clarify that, like if I were to say, like I just said, like how Corot, say, came from Claude and then learned to solve that same problem in his own way, and then Turner came from Claude and learned to solve that same problem in his own way. And so I would say that Claude, Corot, and Turner have all achieved the same goal, but in three different ways. And if I were to look at these masters, maybe when I was younger, when I was in my early 20s, like if I was going through a period when I was obsessed with Turner, I might have tried to make paintings just like Turner. And then if I was obsessed with Corot, I might have tried to make paintings just like Corot or Cole or Durand. But then as I've sort of started to absorb and understand these paintings, and as I felt like I started to understand them deeply, I would make decisions more based on the idea of just understanding what's the same about Claude and what's the same about Corot and what's the same about Turner. And even though those artists achieved their mastery in different ways, I feel like what they came to is the same end. If I were to quantify what I would call that end, I would call it sort of the revelation of a higher notion of beauty. And what I mean by that is that a work of art that I consider to be a really great work of art, it's not just because of little things about it that I really like, or because of the parts or the way the paint is handled or the texture. For a really great painting, I want to sit in front of it for 20 minutes or so, and I want to feel the profound, beautiful effect of that painting. And I think that that's the thing that really separates the men from the boys in the history of art. There were always people that were more technically proficient than Vermeer, and there was always somebody who could paint a tree more tightly than Corot. But the ones that really do it, they really find some way, whether it's this or that, to deeply stir their viewer's soul. And I think that should be considered the direct goal of art, and that if you achieve that goal, that other things will be forgiven by the generations of human beings to come.
So they're really drawing on something much deeper than technique.
I think so.
I'd like to understand a little bit about how you got where you are. You are a young man, 30. You have an incredible ability, an incredible talent. Your paintings move people. I've been with you when you've painted, among other people, and your paintings get response unlike paintings that others do. You've accomplished a great goal by doing that. Where did it start? Where did this desire to paint come from?
Well, something that's so deeply woven into the fabric of the history of my life is I think something that's kind of hard to define. I could probably talk for a long time about all the landscapes I was exposed to when I was younger, and their effect, and how I was always drawing when I was younger, and then I was drawing into high school, and for some reason I did have this obsession with working on paper, drawing things, and I always did that. And so I had a fair understanding by the end of high school that what I was going to want to do with my life was going to be something with using this pencil and brush on paper, And I think it didn't have much meaning for me at that time, except that I just had to keep doing it, and I had to get better and better at it. And I kept drawing, and I drew the figures, and I drew everything I could draw. But I think if I were to try to define a turning point where trying to achieve greatness in art became my purpose in life rather than, other things, finding girls and having fun and these things. I was in RISD and I was in the illustration department, and I was starting to have that feeling that although I liked that I was painting and drawing, I was beginning to realize that the illustration assignments weren't doing it for me. Like art for this or that purpose wasn't lining up with what I was wanting to do. But I wasn't sure why. And then I had some philosophy classes in ancient philosophy, and I read some Socratic dialogues, and there was a particular moment in Plato's Symposium in a Socratic dialogue where there was this prescription. There was just this one passage that I still have highlighted in the book that I think has had a profound effect on my life. And what it essentially describes is that in life, the noble pursuit in life is to, well, let me put this another way. What it describes is through the course of life mounting a staircase towards a higher notion of beauty. And at the end of that staircase, at the top, is an idea that they call absolute beauty. And the passage basically describes a progression whereby we come from fair forms to from fair forms to fair actions, and fair actions to fair ideas, and slowly mounting through our understanding of the universe to these larger scale universal ideas which embody absolute beauty. And I thought to myself, and as it said in the text, it said that was the noblest and best purpose, the contemplation of absolute beauty as a way to happiness. And it struck me right away that would be a good thing to try and understand by painting. And so that's what I've been trying to do.
So have you accomplished happiness?
Has anyone truly and completely accomplished happiness? I think I still have a drive to do more, and every time I finish a painting, I still feel like I have something else to learn or something else to gain. So I guess I guess there's still something else on that staircase to go.
Well, I think you really hope that the staircase never ends.
Yeah.
Because growth is important, stagnation is not. I had a very famous artist tell me over dinner one night that even though he's one of the best artists in the world and knows it, he struggles. He can't still accomplish everything that he wants to accomplish. Still doesn't feel like he's done a great painting. And this is someone who's pushing 80 years old, has been painting for a long, long time. So the satisfaction, part of that satisfaction comes from growing and conquering. And part of that happiness is understanding that you've taken yourself to the next level.
I agree with that statement. And I think the only thing that I would include with that, in addition to what you're saying that has been very important to me, is even though maybe as human beings we can't have perfection, or maybe in my life I won't do what I think is a perfect painting, I think that for me at least, just having that idea of absolute beauty at the end, the idea that there is perfection, and that if I seek it as well as I can, that perhaps I can arrive there.
So you were at RISD, you took these philosophy classes, and now you're on the stair towards happiness. What happened then?
Oh boy. Well, I knew when I was done with RISD what I wanted to accomplish with painting, but I didn't know how to accomplish it. And I was really studying the figure at that time. Like I had done a lot of model painting, and I started to touch on anatomy. There was an anatomy instructor there, and I was trying to figure out how to go on with. I was doing large sort of paintings with some figures in them and figures in landscape, and I really wanted to do what I believed I should do, which was know those master paintings deeply and make something that's really, to me, just like what they were doing, and in its essence, and I felt like I had more to learn to do that, and so I went to the New York Academy for a master's degree, and I studied a lot of figure there, and it had a great anatomy program, and it had cast drawing, which I really liked because I could sort of freely study these casts in a way that I felt helped me to understand the art behind the sculpture, essentially. And I completed the New York Academy, and I was still finding my way and still feeling like I needed to learn more. I did a lot of master studies. I did a lot of copying after Raphael and others. But something that was important for me through all of this education, including RISD and through the New York Academy, was that whatever I was studying and whatever instructors were teaching me, I was always trying to make my own work on the side, whether it was in the evenings or on the weekends, or if class was 4 days, I'd be doing it the other 3 days. I was just always trying to apply whatever I was learning to the act of making art, to make the paintings that I really wanted to make. And I think for me that gave me a lot of clarity of purpose, a lot of reality checks in terms of understanding what I really knew and what I didn't know. I think it can be easy to think that by the end of this education, then I'll have what I need to begin my art making. And what I've found is that you learn about art making by art making, and I think that by doing that alongside my education, by really trying to achieve my goals with what I was learning, it was easier for me to see what parts of what I was learning was really helpful and what parts were not so helpful. And that way I could easily distinguish who was a very effective instructor who was giving me lots of good stuff that was really helping with my work that was on the side, and other instructors that gave some things that were technical and helpful, and then other things that weren't so helpful. And I found it to be a very adequate test of the quality of knowledge or the quality of information that I was getting to simply try to apply these things in the paintings that I wanted to make, and then go to the museum and compare the ideas that were being presented to me to actual masterworks, or works that I feel were very strong and moving and powerful works.
Which artist would you say is your muse? Is there one?
I don't think I can choose one artist to say that's 100% my muse. I think if I refer back to my little idea that I was talking about before, I think that the muse is the common thread between all artists. The muse is the inspiration, and it's the thing that that ties them all together. And the greatest ones are the ones that are closest to that thread. And the more mediocre ones are a little further away. You know, it's like, it's as if there was a line of perfection, and the proximity to it was the factor.
Now, you chose something that, from a purely practical standpoint, may not be very practical. You chose to paint Hudson River School paintings. It's obviously American paintings, Hudson River School paintings, are very popular among a certain group of people. They're wonderful paintings. But there may not be a huge demand for that. You've got to make a living. You've chosen that where you could have chosen to spend a lot more time on figurative work. I know you've made and sold some figurative work for a church in Ireland and some other things. But what is it about the selection of becoming essentially a Hudson River School style painter that really gets you excited, that really makes you move in that direction?
When I started to move strongly in that direction over the European landscape masters that also have a strong effect on me, was probably 3 or 4 years ago. You know, let me just backtrack even a little before that. Like I was making a lot of landscapes that were in large part a mix of mostly imagination and study from masters with a little bit of study from nature. And then 3 or 4 years ago, when I went on the Hudson River Fellowship, I had the opportunity to really spend that entire month just outside painting. And we really, you know, it's free independent research on the fellowship. Like you go out and you do what you want to do. But what I ended up doing was just getting up at 7 in the morning and painting through until sunset every day for a month. And I think something about being outside like that every day and being in those spots where Thomas Cole painted and where Durand and Gifford painted, and finding these exact spots where they were, and just seeing the profound beauty of the actual reality of those spots, it really drove me to really want to understand deeply that something that's a little bit closer to home. You know, which I've had limited experience in the European landscape. I've been there a number of times, but I've had a lot of deep experiences with the American landscape. And so I think my connection with those artists has a lot to do with subject matter, you know, the beauty of this land that I find very profound and that I've grown up with. And so after discovering this stuff deeply in the Hudson Valley, as I was sort of returning home to the White Mountains in New Hampshire, I was finding the same thing there. Like, oh, there's the Thomas Cole painting of Crawford Notch. There's, you know, there's the Bierstadt vista of the Moat Mountains. And like, I drove by these sites every day when I was going to high school, and I knew they were there and I knew they were beautiful, but somehow just connecting to these artists and feeling like this is still there, you know, these things are still there just exactly as they were the day these guys painted them. And you can see exactly what they exaggerated and what they felt and what they changed. And I just loved that, and I loved that feeling of doing something that's completely new and completely observable today, but just knowing that it's the exact same thing that has always been there, or at least has been there for 100 years.
So you get one wish granted, and we pick the wish. That one wish is you get 2 hours in a room with those guys, the Hudson River School painters. What are the questions?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Wow. I mean, I feel like I would just want to inject myself into that conversation, you know. I would almost want to just hear what the guys would say talking to each other, and then see what questions I had from what they were saying. I mean, I think like, I'll tell you what certainly doesn't jump to my mind is what medium did you use? What green did you use? and what brush is that? Though I think those things are great for students who are struggling to understand the materials. I feel like what I really want to know is like, what was the very last thing you did to that painting? What was it that really, I find there's a turning point in a painting, where it's coming along for weeks and months, and like somehow something clicks, or you change something, or just some little thing makes the difference that somehow shifts the painting from just what it wasn't a second ago into something that's just completely unified and completely different and so much more effective. And I'd love to hear from these guys how they felt about that topic, how a painting gets finished. How much do you change things around? Like, I know I'm always doing things like removing trees and moving earth around and adding figures and taking figures away and trying to put a cow in and taking a cow away. And like, I'd just like to know, how much did these guys struggle with the exact same problems that I'm struggling with, or if they tended to create a design and just stick to it, or, I'm sure it's different for different artists, but I'd love to just, I feel like there's plenty of evidence that these guys believed in a philosophy that was similar to the kind of things that I've been talking about. I see that in the writings of Durand and Cole, and I would love to talk to them about that philosophy and see how they feel they've been achieving it with painting. I think that would be a wonderful experience. That reminds me of part of Dante's Inferno, where he was talking about the levels of hell, and there was this kind of nice level of hell for the Greek philosophers to just sit and chat about their thing. And I always thought it was funny when I read that part. I was like, oh, that sounds kind of nice. Like, it's the good part of hell, You think of like the blues man, like Robert Johnson, like going to the crossroads to learn the blues or something.
There is no good part.
Yeah.
These, some of these people left a very special gift. Asher Durand published and wrote in the Crayon, which was an art publication primarily. I've been privileged to hold those original copies in my hands and look through them. And he wrote his 12 letters on landscape painting. Is there anything in those 12 letters that are especially important to you?
Well, yes. I mean, I've read those letters, and I find a lot of it very profound. Something that I was looking at the last time that I read them that I think struck a chord with me especially was Durand was discussing Raphael, and I like that because I love Durand and I love Raphael. But
who doesn't?
Yeah, I can't remember his exact words, but I remember what I took from this statement was that Durand had a great love for drawing from nature, and he talks a lot about the artist, recommending to the young artist to go forth and really study nature. And that's with a capital N, which to me means not necessarily exactly what nature looks like, but the true nature of things, or what it is, what it really is. And I think that sentiment that I just expressed was clarified in this discussion of Raphael, where Durand essentially asserts that when Raphael was drawing from life, that this thing that he was drawing was actually what he perceived,
Right.
what he perceived in the thing. And as we know, Raphael compared to a photograph of a nude model is very, very different, very idealized. And to have someone like Durand, the naturalist, say essentially that this ideal reality was actually what Raphael perceived when he looked at the world is I think, a powerful assertion, because it sort of reveals the idea I was talking about with the staircase, this idea that Raphael's perception of beauty or perception of reality was so high that he could create reality within this completely ideal, like perfected, elegant world. And I think when you look at Durand's paintings, you can see that. I think like at first they introduce you with this very true naturalism, but as you start to like exist in that world, I think, for me at least, I really start to say, wow, this is the beautiful reality. This is more than meets the eye.
Well, and if they transform someone to a better place, there's so much value in that. And there are the purists who say, well, you want to copy exactly what you see, but I don't see that as being the purpose. If you want to copy what you see, take a photograph. I remember an artist friend of mine telling me about a cancer patient who bought a painting of his and put it on the wall while she went through months of chemotherapy and stayed in bed. And she said that painting pulled her through it, that painting took her to a different place. It was almost a sense of meditation and staring at it. And I think that's what you're able to accomplish. I get that very special feeling when I look at one of your paintings. They have a special quality about them. I can't articulate what that quality is. I study them, I look at them. I've spent a lot of time with you this week. I've seen you create paintings, and I still can't figure it out. So there's something about that finalization that you've been able to accomplish too, which I think is powerful. If you were talking to the parent of a young child or a teenager who wanted to explore a life of art, or someone who maybe is my age who says, you know what, it's time for me to take that next step. What things for you were a waste? What things did you not get? What things do you wish you got? And what would you tell people to pursue, to read, to understand?
I think that you certainly can't force anyone, to pursue art. I think that that's a drive that's internal, or at least in my experience. What my feeling about my development and some of those living artists who I respect the most, I look at what they do and it seems like they couldn't really do anything else. And I think in some sense, truly pursuing art at the highest level is something that isn't entirely a choice that you make by reason. There's definitely an intuition involved, and I guess I would recommend to someone who's driven to that, who's really driven to want to make great paintings, that they do that. There's one thing standing in the way between making great paintings and not doing that, and I think that thing is a fear, that develops from all kinds of factors in your life, and I just think that if that's fundamental and that's in you, that you have to do it. You have to try to do the things that you don't think somewhere inside of you that you can do. You have to try to do them. because this task, when you look at a museum masterpiece and you think like, how would I make a painting like that? The task seems so large and overwhelming that it can be intimidating and it can even seem impossible. Like, I have to learn anatomy, I have to learn perspective, all these things, you know, all these schools of knowledge and sciences and religion and philosophy, all these things are piled up into this one epic thing which humanity has put on a pedestal and raised up and lit with beautiful big lights, you know? and it's intimidating, and I just think I would recommend, like, go for it, you know? Try to do that thing that's just what you want to do. And you'll fail, and you'll learn so much more by failing than you will by not trying.
Well, clearly, somebody who has the passion, like myself, I had the passion, and I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and I was frustrated, and I tried more. And I remember very specifically, as a matter of fact, I still have the unfinished canvas. I was doing a figure painting, and I could not get what was in my head onto the canvas. And I tried that painting over and over and over. It seemed like for months, and I couldn't get there. And my wife, in a moment of my frustration, said, "You need to go study with somebody." And I did, and I feel like I skipped about 12 years just going from one level to a much higher level because of having the benefit of that education from that master that I studied under. And I think that having someone to show you the way, you have to find your own way. You have to make your own mistakes. Clearly, that's a very big part of the learning process. But you also need to have that feedback. You need to have someone who is pulling it out of you, and someone who is also helping you answer some of those questions, because you know, we're talking about 600 years of technique that have been passed from one generation to another, and a body of knowledge which has increased exponentially. And we need to help people find some of that body of knowledge. Too much too fast is not appropriate. Some of it needs to be self-discovery. But assuming that we have that drive, assuming we have that passion, where does that person who's watching this right now, who wants to get there, where do they go? Because sometimes reading in a book isn't enough.
I mean, if I have one recommendation in that regard, I would say to look a lot at the actual works produced by the artists that you're going to learn from, and try to seek those living artists that produce most closely what you feel that you're looking for.
Chase what you respect.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, like, I've had a lot of instructors of all different kinds, and the ones that I've sort of stuck with are the people that I've come to really respect their work, and I think that would be the main thing. You know, make sure that you're climbing a ladder that you want to climb. You know, if you look at you know, when you're setting out down the beginning, look at the end. You know, if the end of what an artist is producing is different from what you want to make, you need to know what those differences are when you go to study with them, and make sure you know what you want, you know, what you want to learn.
One thing that I experienced in my own life, and I see it happen time and again with artists and with collectors, is that you grow. I shudder at the things that I liked when I was 17 years old. Thank goodness I didn't have them tattooed on my body, because I would seriously regret that now. And I watched myself go through this transformation process of increasing the level of sophistication of what I became passionate about. And it's interesting in my world where I started out as a painter with garish colors and things that I look back on now. I keep my old paintings because I want to refer to them as just as a memory, and sometimes I want to burn them because I don't want them to be something I'd be remembered for. But it's nice to be able to look back. I showed you a painting that I did that was a copy of a Durand or something, and I look at it now and the colors are garish and the edges are too sharp and there's no depth to it. And I still haven't accomplished where I want to go, but I think it's interesting to see how we jump from level to level. I see collectors who they buy things that now they look back and say 5 years later, I can't even believe I bought that. I had a collector tell me he had $500,000 worth of art in the basement in a storage room because he couldn't stand to look at it anymore, and he couldn't sell it because it was no longer worth any money. So what is that learning process? How do I, as a viewer, pull myself up to that next level? I find, for instance, if you look at your paintings, and if you look at the paintings of, say, Corot, they're gray. They're not bright, garish colors at all, and yet when you look at them, you feel like you're in nature, and they feel right. They don't feel unnatural at all.
Well, I guess I think you got to answering your own question a little bit there. I think that if you look at the painting, I guess as a collector or a viewer or appreciator of art, I would say don't be influenced at all by the things that are around you. These paintings that are great were made to be understood by you, and you don't need to be influenced by art dealers, and you don't need to be influenced by rhetoric and whatever's being said to you, because great art was made for you, and you can tell if it is creating that meditative, high, beautiful sensation in you. And I think that if you can look deeply and honestly into yourself and tap that powerful sensation, then you have connoisseurship in art. And so from that point, it's up to you to say, by knowing that this has affected me deeply, that I'm collecting something that's going to last. If I've never heard someone say that they've fallen out of love with a painting that, I'm sure that the person that you discussed that had that painting that in some way contributed to saving their life, I'm sure they're not going to fall out of love with that painting. And I think that if a painting gives you that thing that's that powerful, and if you're able to identify it, then you're going to be a good collector.
Let your heart speak to you.
Yes.
Well, Erik, this has been a wonderful chat. You're a brilliant painter. You've got a wonderful career ahead of you, and I'm very proud of you and proud of what you've been able to accomplish at your young age, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you accomplish in the next 50 years, and I'll be there watching.
Thank you, Erik, very much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
I hope you enjoyed this segment of Techniques with the Hudson River School Masters with Erik Koeppel. If you want to learn more about that, you can find it at lilyartvideo.com. I'm Erik Rhodes. Keep on painting.
So I've got my deep space plane established, and I'm going to move forward to that secondary hill. And while I'm working on that hill, I'm going to be thinking of the transition forward into the middle ground. So as I work on this area, I'm not just thinking hill, I'm going to be thinking furthest back hill, moving to forward hill, moving to middle ground, and that way I'll be moving one loop of space that's going to prepare me to work on the foreground. And I always want to have that in mind, that this hill is not a flat phenomenon. It's a large mass of earth that's moving in space, and that's going to be crucial to this composition. It's really where that atmosphere starts to materialize itself into forms, and we're going to try and get as much detail as we can into the forms of that area without bringing it forward. So I need a more purpley, cool shadow color. I'm going to get that Venetian red a little bit closer to that white, and I'll put a little ultramarine blue over there, and I'll create this area right there. Someone described the area on Gifford's palette as where he mixed colors as a battleground. So if I want to make a purple, the battleground will be here between red, white, and blue. Let's get a little bluer purple. Let's see where we are. I want more white in that. I want a nice even, more white for a cool color will make a nice even layer of space. And so I'm just putting a nice load of white into there and spreading it around so it has a smooth atmospheric quality. I'm going to start to come up to the edge of the contour of the hill. I'm going to try and not make it too even. I'm going to add little tree edges up there in a little bit. I'll add some texture to it. I'm going to use a warm brown color because I know a little bit of that color from the sky underneath is going to come through. So I've got burnt sienna and burnt umber. I'm also going to grab a brush to use as a maul stick. And I wanted to move my tree in a little bit closer to the landscape. So I think I'm going to plant that pair of trees right about here, just leaving a little bit of area behind it. And I'm just going to add a little bit more medium so it's a nice light line when I start to trace out where I'm going to place this tree in the composition. I want it to be, I want it to have that feeling of loft, that it really swoops out into the landscape and rises up into this area of space. So this doesn't have to be perfect trunks yet. I'm just planning out the big motion of this tree so I know that it'll occupy the space that I want it to occupy. And these lines will probably get buried under the more detailed work as the tree develops. And these beautiful oaks always have these lovely swoops in their branches, and I'll start to think about that as I block this in. Isn't it kind of nice the way this curve here counteracts the curve of that hill and makes a lovely harmonic design that is subtle. It doesn't beat you over the head with it, but it's apparent, and it's a gesture that shoots back into space. Those two things against each other. So I'll plan a little bit where I'm going to have the counter curving tree and its sort of massive foliage. And then I know I'm going to have some more trees over here blocking out a lot of the distant space on that side. And so if I have these ones planted on the ground here and here, then I have a deeper position of space here to sort of create a nice grouping of trees to cover up that space so that we can really get back into the composition. A lot of times when I'm painting a studio painting, I'll go through several different figures before I find an option I like. but I might also wait a long time and look at the painting. And as I've looked at it for days and days, I sometimes discover right where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing. So we'll see if that happens later.